So, Mark Carney submitted one report to the IMF, and the Trump administration's trade war numbers collapsed in public. Not in a Canadian government press release, not in an op-ed by a Democratic economist, not in a foreign government's rebuttal statement that the White House could characterize as self-interested. In an assessment published by the International Monetary Fund, the institution headquartered in Washington, D.C., whose largest single shareholder is the United States of America, whose executive board is chaired by an American, and whose founding after World War II was an American project designed to create the stable international economic order that American prosperity has depended on for 80 years. The IMF looked at the administration's trade numbers, the specific figures that had been cited in press briefings, in White House statements, in congressional testimony, in the president's rally appearances for 153 days, and published an economic assessment that contradicted 3 of those figures with the kind of clinical footnoted, methodologically documented precision that international economic institutions deploy when they are not being diplomatic and are simply being correct. The administration had been claiming $400 billion in tariff revenue. The IMF's assessment put the actual figure at $47 billion, with the remainder representing costs passed through to American consumers and businesses, not revenue captured by the American government. The administration had been citing 200,000 jobs created by the tariff strategy. The IMF's assessment, incorporating cross-border supply chain employment effects that the administration's figures had excluded, showed a net employment impact of negative 83,000 jobs in the sectors most affected by Canada trade disruption. These corrections did not happen quietly in a published document that circulated only among economists. They happened at an IMF press briefing on camera when a journalist asked the fund's spokesperson to comment on the discrepancy, and the spokesperson confirmed the IMF's figures without qualification. Warren Buffett, who has watched economic institutions correct political arithmetic for 63 years, said, "When the institution you founded tells you your numbers are wrong, the numbers are wrong. The only remaining question is what you do about it." When you understand what Carney put in that report, how it moved through the IMF's assessment process, and what the administration's economists did when the IMF's spokesperson confirmed the discrepancy on camera, you'll understand why economists on both sides of this dispute are saying this week that the evidentiary foundation of the trade war has permanently changed. Hit subscribe because the IMF's numbers are now in the public record, and every institution that uses IMF data is going to update its own assessments in the coming days. Let me walk you through how we got here. Because Mark Carney did not hand the IMF one report without a very specific understanding of what that institution does with the information it receives. And that understanding comes from the specific biographical fact that makes him uniquely positioned to have done this. Mark Carney spent 8 years as a central bank governor, first as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, during which he navigated the Canadian economy through the 2008 financial crisis with a discipline and a precision that produced outcomes that other central banks studied as a case study in crisis management. Then as governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, where he managed the most consequential peacetime economic transition in British history, the post-Brexit uncertainty, under the sustained pressure of a political environment that would have broken lesser economists. During both tenures, Carney maintained a deep, working peer-level relationship with the IMF's institutional machinery. He sat on committees. He contributed to assessments. He understood the IMF's methodology the way that people who have used it for 2 decades understand it, not from the outside as a political actor, but from the inside as a practitioner who has spent years in the rooms where the institution's economic judgments are formed. When the Canada trade dispute began, Carney understood something specific that most of the political commentary was missing. The administration's trade numbers were not just politically convenient. They were methodologically vulnerable, and the IMF was the institution best positioned to make that vulnerability visible. both because the IMF's economic assessments carry the institutional authority that no single government's rebuttal can match, and because the IMF's methodology for measuring trade impacts is specifically designed to capture the cross-border supply chain effects that the administration's figures had been consistently excluding. The administration's $400 billion tariff revenue figure was the most prominent vulnerability. Most people don't realize that there is a specific and significant difference between the gross tariff revenue collected on imports from Canada and the net economic benefit of that revenue to the United States government. Gross tariff revenue counts every dollar paid in tariffs on Canadian goods crossing the border. It does not subtract the portion of those tariffs that is effectively passed through to American consumers in the form of higher prices on goods that contain Canadian inputs. It does not subtract the reduction in American export revenue produced by Canadian counter tariffs. It does not subtract the economic cost of supply chain disruption absorbed by American businesses that depend on the $14.2 billion daily relationship with Canada. When all of those effects are incorporated, as the IMF's methodology requires, the net figure is significantly different from the gross figure. $47 billion versus $400 billion is not a rounding error. It is a methodological choice. The administration had been making one choice. The IMF uses a different one. And the difference between those two choices, in dollar terms, is $353 billion of claimed benefit that exists in press releases and rally speeches and does not exist in the economic data. Carney knew this. He had known it since the first week of the dispute, and he spent 4 months building the documentation in collaboration with Canadian Treasury economists, with Bank of Canada staff who understood the bilateral data in granular detail, and with IMF staff contacts who could confirm, informally, that Canada's methodology was consistent with the fund's own standards before submitting it through the formal channel that would give it the institutional weight it needed to produce the effect it produced. He did not submit it to produce a headline. He submitted it to produce a record. The IMF's headquarters at 719th Street in Washington, D.C., 6 blocks from the White House, 3 blocks from the Federal Reserve, in the specific geography of institutional Washington that signals proximity to power without being absorbed by it, has a press briefing room on the ground floor that is unremarkable in its physical design. Rows of seats, a raised platform, a podium with the IMF seal, cameras positioned for the feeds that go to economic news outlets globally. The room is used for the regular press briefings that the IMF's communications team conducts following the publication of significant assessments. On the morning of the briefing that produced the moment this story is about, the room was approximately 2/3 full. Economic journalists, wire service correspondents covering international financial institutions, staff from several embassies whose economic attaches monitor IMF communications. The briefing was listed on the IMF's public schedule as a standard press conference following the release of the fund's updated bilateral economic assessment covering North American trade dynamics. It was not flagged as significant. It was not the kind of briefing that generates advance attention. The IMF spokesperson, a career institutional economist who has held the communications role through multiple managing director tenures and who has developed, over those years, a specific reputation for answering questions with technical precision rather than diplomatic softening, opened the briefing with a summary of the assessment's key findings. The language was the language of international economic institutions: careful, hedged where appropriate, precise where possible, never inflammatory, always technically grounded. The assessment had been published the previous evening on the IMF's website, a 40-page document whose executive summary contained 3 paragraphs that any trained economist reading it would immediately recognize as a formal methodological disagreement with the American administration's stated trade impact figures. The executive summary did not name the administration's figures. It did not frame the disagreement as political. It presented the IMF's own methodology and the figures it produced, and allowed the reader to draw the arithmetic conclusion. The journalist who asked the question was a correspondent for a major financial wire service who had been covering the IMF for 11 years and who had read the assessment the previous evening and done the arithmetic. She waited until the briefing's third question. She said the IMF's assessment puts net tariff revenue from the U.S.-Canada tariff measures at approximately $47 billion over the period measured. Senior American officials have publicly cited $400 billion in tariff revenue from the same measures. Can you help us understand the discrepancy? The spokesperson did not consult notes. He had anticipated the question, not this question specifically, but the category of question that arises when an IMF assessment's figures differ materially from an important member government's stated figures. He had, according to sources familiar with the briefing preparation, discussed the appropriate response with his team the previous afternoon. He said the figures in our assessment reflect the IMF's standard methodology for measuring net tariff revenue impact, which incorporates pass-through costs to domestic consumers and businesses, counter-tariff impacts on export revenue, and supply chain disruption costs. These are the figures our methodology produces. We are not in a position to comment on the methodology underlying figures published by member governments. The room was quiet for approximately 22 seconds. Not because anyone was shocked by the answer. The answer was technically cautious and institutionally appropriate. The room was quiet because the answer was unambiguous. The IMF spokesperson had confirmed the IMF's figures without qualification, had declined to endorse the administration's methodology, and had done so in 7 sentences that would be quoted in full in every economic publication that covered the briefing. The journalist followed up, and the employment impact figures, the assessment shows negative 83,000 net jobs in the most affected sectors. The administration has cited 200,000 jobs created. Same question about the discrepancy. The spokesperson said, our assessment incorporates employment effects across integrated supply chains, including cross-border supply chain employment that has been affected by trade disruption. The figures in our assessment are the figures our methodology produces. 34 seconds of room silence followed that answer. The briefing continued for another 19 minutes. No subsequent question produced an answer that modified what the first 2 exchanges had established. The IMF's economic assessment was in the public record. The discrepancy between its figures and the administration's figures was in the public record. And the IMF spokesperson had confirmed the fund's figures twice, without qualification, in front of cameras that were feeding to every economic newsroom in the world. In Washington, it was 9:47 in the morning. In the White House Communications Office, where the daily trade briefing talking points were already prepared and had already been reviewed for the morning, someone was watching the IMF feed. And the thing they were watching was the Trade Wars Evidentiary Foundation being publicly challenged by an institution that the United States government cannot characterize as an opponent without characterizing itself as opposed to the international economic order it built. The administration's response took 4 hours. It was not a short 4 hours. According to sources with knowledge of the internal discussions, the communications challenge the IMF briefing produced was distinct from every previous challenge in the dispute, and the distinctness is what took 4 hours. Every previous challenge had come from a source that the administration's response framework knew how to address. Canadian government statements could be characterized as self-interested. Opposition senators could be characterized as politically motivated. Even Buffett's statements, however credible, could be received without directly contradicting them by simply asserting continued confidence in the strategy. None of those response frameworks worked against the IMF. The IMF cannot be characterized as politically motivated. It is an international institution whose governance structure includes the United States as its largest shareholder, whose managing director serves at the pleasure of a board on which the United States holds decisive influence, and whose economic methodology is the global standard against which virtually every other international economic institution calibrates its own assessments. Publicly disputing the IMF's figures means publicly disputing the methodology that the United States government has endorsed, used, and cited in its own international economic engagement for 8 decades. The statement that eventually emerged at 1:53 in the afternoon was, according to sources familiar with its multiple revisions, the product of 4 hours of the administration's best economic communications minds attempting to address a problem for which the available tools were genuinely insufficient. The final version said that the administration's trade impact assessment used a different methodology than the IMF's, that the administration stood by its figures, and that the trade strategy was producing results for American workers and American businesses. What it did not do, dispute any specific IMF figure. Explain what methodology the administration was using that produced $400 billion instead of $47 billion. Address the negative 83,000 net employment figure. Engage with the 40-page IMF assessment on any substantive point. Markets, which do not process communication strategy, only information, had already moved. The IMF briefing's $47 billion figure was incorporated into financial models before the administration's 4-hour response was drafted. Currency markets, bond markets, and equity markets in the sectors most exposed to Canada trade disruption had all moved in directions consistent with a downward revision in the assessed economic benefit of the American tariff strategy. $14.2 billion a day responds to the quality of the economic analysis applied to it. The IMF is the highest quality publicly available analysis on earth, and the analysis it had applied to the $400 billion figure had produced $47 billion. Warren Buffett's response arrived that evening. Warren Buffett released his statement at 4:17 in the afternoon, in the form of a direct response to a question from a financial journalist that he chose to answer in writing rather than by phone. Because, as he has said on multiple occasions, written answers to important questions do not get edited by transcription errors or interrupted by follow-up questions before the central point has been fully made. The statement was 6 paragraphs, the most precise he had written on the Canada dispute, the most technical in the sense of engaging directly with economic methodology, and the most devastating, not in tone, which was, as always, even and deliberate, but in the specific intellectual weight of what it described. When the International Monetary Fund publishes a figure that differs from a government's stated figure by $353 billion, Buffett wrote, the question that every person with a financial stake in the situation needs to ask is not which institution is right. The IMF is right. The question is how the discrepancy happened and what it reveals about the quality of the economic thinking that has been guiding this dispute for 153 days. He addressed the specific methodology question directly, and the directness was significant because Buffett does not typically engage with technical economic methodology in his public communications. He engages with it when the technical question is the story. The difference between $400 billion and $47 billion, he wrote, is not a rounding error, and it is not a dispute between reasonable methodological choices. It is the difference between counting the gross revenue collected at the border and measuring the net economic benefit to the United States, after accounting for the costs that flow from that collection, costs paid by American consumers, American businesses, and American workers, whose supply chain relationships cross the border in both directions. The administration chose to count the gross. The IMF measures the net. In 63 years of investing, I have never seen a business succeed that confused gross with net. I have seen many businesses fail for precisely that confusion. He turned to the employment figures. Negative 83,000 jobs versus positive 200,000 jobs is not a dispute about data. It is a dispute about what counts. The administration's figure counts jobs in sectors whose output competes with Canadian imports and assigns those jobs as benefits of the tariff strategy. The IMF's figure counts those jobs and also counts the jobs in sectors whose production depends on the $14.2 billion daily relationship with Canada, the automotive supply chain workers, the agricultural processing workers, the cross-border logistics workers, and measures the net. When you count only the benefits and exclude the costs, you can make any strategy look successful. The IMF, which is required by its mandate to count both, produced a figure that is different. And then the historical passage. In 63 years of watching markets and governance, I have observed that governments that use numbers selectively, counting benefits and excluding costs, measuring gross and calling it net, always reach a moment of institutional correction. The correction is never comfortable. It is always better than the alternative, which is building further policy on a numerical foundation that does not exist. Today's IMF briefing was that moment for this trade strategy. The institution that the United States built to provide exactly this kind of correction provided it. The appropriate response is to receive it. Buffett's verdict: you cannot negotiate a $760 billion trade relationship back to health using numbers that an 8-decade-old American institution just corrected by $353 billion. The negotiation needs to begin from the actual numbers. The actual numbers are the ones in the 40-page IMF assessment. Everything else is arithmetic theater. What the IMF's correction of the administration's trade numbers produces, in institutional terms, in market terms and policy terms, and in the terms of the $760 billion relationship itself, cascades through every system that uses economic data to make decisions. Begin with the most immediate and most significant layer, the institutions that take their economic baseline from the IMF. The World Bank, the OECT, the Bank for International Settlements, the major central banks of every allied nation, the Congressional Budget Office, which is required by its mandate to use internationally validated economic data in its scoring of federal legislation and its projections of economic impacts. Every one of these institutions has now received an IMF assessment that places the net tariff revenue of the U.S.-Canada dispute at $47 billion and the net employment impact at negative 83,000 jobs. Every one of them will update their own assessments accordingly. Every one of those updated assessments will go into the models that governments, markets, and legislatures use to make economic decisions. The Congressional Budget Office dimension is the most immediately politically significant. The CBO is used by Congress to score trade legislation, to calculate the economic impact of trade bills before they are voted on. The CBO uses IMF-consistent methodology. If the CBO is asked to score, for example, legislation that would formalize the current tariff structure or legislation that would modify it, the numbers it produces will be based on the IMF's $47 billion and negative 83,000 job baselines, not the administration's figures. This means that any congressional vote on Canada trade policy now occurs in an information environment where the official independent economic scorekeeper of the United States Congress is working from numbers that are $353 billion different from the executive branch's stated position. That is not a communications problem. It is a governance problem. The market dimension has already begun to work through. Financial institutions that have been modeling the Canada trade dispute's economic impact using the administration's stated figures that have been the most available quantification of the dispute's economics for 153 days, are now reassessing those models against the IMF's published data. $47 billion in net tariff revenue produces a different risk-adjusted assessment of the dispute's economic sustainability than $400 billion. Negative 83,000 net jobs produces a different political sustainability assessment than positive 200,000. These are not small adjustments. They are the kind of adjustments that change the probability distribution that financial institutions use to model when and how the dispute resolves. And probability distributions, once updated, change capital allocation decisions. The adversary dimension is, again, the one that receives the least official attention and carries the longest strategic tail. China and Russia and every government conducting a systematic assessment of American credibility as an economic actor have been watching this dispute for 153 days. What they have observed today is the international institution that the United States built, that the United States funds, that the United States governs, publishing an economic assessment that contradicts the American government's stated trade figures by $353 billion at a briefing in Washington, D.C., 6 blocks from the White House, in front of cameras that fed the correction to every economic newsroom in the world. That observation is not primarily about the trade dispute. It is about the relationship between American official economic claims and American-built international economic institutions. When those institutions diverge from American official claims, publicly, on camera in Washington, the gap between what America says and what American-founded institutions calculate is visible to every capital that has been deciding how much weight to place on American economic representations in their own policy deliberations. The question those capitals are now asking is not whether the IMF or the administration is right. They are asking what it means that the divergence happened, and they are incorporating the answer into planning that extends far beyond this trade dispute. What Mark Carney submitted to the IMF, one report, built over 4 months of economic documentation, using the methodology that central bankers apply when they need numbers that will survive institutional scrutiny, was not complicated. The complication was never in the methodology. The methodology is standard. It is the methodology that the IMF has used for 8 decades and that the United States has endorsed, funded, and cited throughout those 8 decades as the appropriate standard for international economic assessment. The complication was in the specific numbers the methodology produced when applied to the Canada trade dispute. $47 billion instead of $400 billion. Negative 83,000 jobs instead of positive 200,000. A $353 billion gap between the claimed benefit and the measured benefit that has now been published by the institution best positioned to publish it and confirmed on camera by the spokesperson of that institution in front of the cameras of every economic newsroom in the world. The $760 billion relationship, $14.2 billion every single day. One report, 2 numbers confirmed on camera in a briefing room 6 blocks from the White House, and a 34-second silence that in its specific length and its specific location in the institutional geography of international economic life described something that 4 months of bilateral diplomatic communications had not managed to describe. That the numerical foundation of this trade strategy does not match the numerical reality of the trade relationship it was applied to. Warren Buffett wrote that you cannot negotiate a $760 billion relationship back to health using numbers that an 8-decade-old American institution just corrected by $353 billion. He is right. Not because the IMF is infallible, because the IMF's methodology is the standard. The standard the United States built and the standard the United States governs. And when that standard produces figures that differ from official claims by $353 billion, the standard is not the problem. The IMF briefing room at 719th Street in Washington is 6 blocks from the White House. The correction that was confirmed in that room at 9:47 in the morning traveled 6 blocks and arrived in the form of a 4-hour scramble and a statement that disputed nothing specific and modified nothing material. $353 billion confirmed on camera at an institution founded by the United States. In Washington, D.C., the actual numbers are now in the public record. The actual numbers are the ones the $760 billion relationship has to be negotiated from. And the gap between the actual numbers and the stated numbers is not a gap that closes with a press release. It closes with a strategy built on arithmetic that survives institutional scrutiny. And building that strategy from numbers that the IMF will not subsequently correct on camera is what the people managing this dispute need to do now. Because the clock the W2 started in Geneva is still running. The $89 billion in permanent supply chain redirection is still compounding. And the 34 seconds of silence in that IMF briefing room this morning is not going to get shorter in anyone's memory. The numbers fell apart on the spot. What gets built in their place is the question that comes next.